Hello everyone. So Hifiman recently released a slew of new headphones and I have them all here in front of me, so I'm going to talk about them. Now this is just an initial impressions video. We're going to have a dedicated review coming for most of these models in the near future with proper measurements. I just wanted to share some of my thoughts after spending a bit of time with all four of these. Now the models that we have here are the HE600, which I'm going to leave that one till last because spoiler alert, this one is my favorite. The Ananda Unveiled, the successor to the Audivina, the Audivina LE. And the edition XV as well, which I'm going to start with this one because I think that this one is probably going to be the most interesting to people. Not only because it's one of the most accessibly priced, this comes in at $400, whereas something like the HE600 is about $800, so twice as much, but also because this one in particular, as well as the HE600, some of the directions in which the tuning has been taken on this are a little bit different from previous Hifiman models, and I think work to address some of the main gripes that people tend to have with existing Hifiman models. The first thing we have to talk about though is build, because there are some updates on all four of these models which I think are pretty big improvements versus existing Hifiman headphones, particularly at the lower cost range. So Hifiman historically has used this style of headband for their lower cost models. This is a Dakoni Blue, but you can also find it on some of the more expensive ones like the Shangri-La Mini. It's just a single arch with sort of minimal padding, leather covered, and the problems were that it just looks and feels a bit cheap. It's very lightweight, it does offer some swivel in the cups, but this is not particularly well padded, it's not very comfortable. I got hot spots after listening for more than 5 or 10 minutes on all of the models that are using this particular headband style. And also, specifically for the ones like the Shangri-La Mini, if you're paying potentially over $1,000 or $2,000 for a headphone, I just don't think that this particular headband is what you would want for a headphone that expensive. This just does not have that premium feel to it, and when you put this next to a Meze Empyrean or something, it's not really okay. Luckily, Hifiman has updated this, so this is their new headband design, and I think it's quite an improvement from their existing cheap headband design. It also shares a lot in common with the headband on their more high-end products like the HE1000 line and the Sesvara, as well as the Shangri-La Senior. Both of them are now using a suspension strap. The high-end headband is using a single shaped metal piece, whereas this, it's a plastic construction with a metal plate covering it. The only difference between the Edition XV and the rest of them is that the Edition XV has a silver covering, whereas the others, like the HE600, have a black covering. It is still metal, it's just a different color, that's all. This just looks a lot more premium, it feels a lot better, it's just more deserving of being on a high-end headphone, and most importantly, it's very comfortable. This is exactly the kind of thing that I really like because it distributes the weight really evenly. You've still got the full range of adjustment just by clicking that in and out. The yokes have also been redesigned, so these are now a shaped piece of metal. And again, this doesn't really affect comfort itself. You can still swivel them though. It just looks and feels more high-end and premium. This is the kind of thing that you want to see on a several hundred to potentially several $1,000 headphone, not this. The other design change is that on the Edition XV and the HE600, the grille has been revised. So now it's a sort of hexagonal shape to all of the different openings, and as you go towards the edge, they also get a little bit smaller and narrower, which gives it a bit of a accented sort of contoured aesthetic. I think it looks really good. It's a nice change. I have no idea how much this affects things acoustically, but nonetheless, it just looks pretty. The grille and exterior of the Ananda Unveiled is pretty much visually identical to the HE1000 Unveiled. The magnet structure is a little bit different. In fact, here you can see it's got alternating styles of magnets. So there's a rectangular one, then a round one, then a rectangular one, whereas it's just all rounded ones on the HE1000. But the actual housing itself seems to be, in fact, potentially exactly identical. The only difference is that this outer lip here seems to go a little bit further in on the Ananda, whereas it's a little bit more towards the edge on the HE1000. Visually, very similar, mostly just differentiated by the headband. Okay, so I want to talk about the Edition XV first, because this, again, I think is the one that most people are going to find interesting, not only because this is $400, so it's pretty accessible, and honestly, for that price, I think the overall build is pretty excellent. But also, just the fact that this deviates from the traditional Hifiman tuning in one critical way, which is that it's just not as bright. And the main complaint that I've seen with most people that don't like Hifiman headphones is that they find them too bright. If you ask most people that don't like the Sesvara, for instance, why they didn't like it, more often than not, they'll say it's because it was just a bit too bright for me. And this kind of fixes that by just toning down the treble a bit. It also does pass the massive noggin test, which is good. Although actually, one other thing to note is when you pull it taut like that, the headband becomes completely flat and you can't pull it any further. So it does feel a bit weird when you put it on your head, but nonetheless, I have an enormous noggin and it fits very comfortably, and I've actually got a notch or two to spare, so that's always good. Listening to these now, throughout the bass and most of the mid-range, they are functionally identical to the HE1000 Unveiled and most other headphones like the original Aria. Less so the Aria Stealth, because that's got a bit more of a sort of mid-bass focus, but actually this and the HE1000 Unveiled, up to about 1 kilohertz, basically identical. There's almost no discernible difference there. It then goes into a bit of a soundstage dip, but it doesn't sound like it's got quite as much of a soundstage dip as the other Hifiman headphones. Not necessarily because it doesn't have as much of a soundstage dip, but because the overall ear gain and upper treble is lower, a little bit toned down. It's just a little bit more relaxed whilst still having kind of fairly present upper treble. In fact, the upper treble itself, above 10K or so, doesn't seem like it's taken down too much. The big difference is between kind of 2 kilohertz and about 7 or so kilohertz. Throughout that whole space, it just seems to be a couple dB lower than what I'm used to on the HE1000 Unveiled or the Sesvara Unveiled, and I'm really enjoying it. It just makes it a little bit more relaxed, far less prone to any track which could be a little bit shouty. It just makes it a slightly more relaxed listen. The main drawback to having a big soundstage dip is that screws with timbre a bit. So male vocals in particular, I often find can be a little bit nasally sounding if you have a really big 2 kilohertz dip. And so HE600, for example, I often find that vocals come across just a little bit thin. This still has that dip, but because the rest of the treble is lower and closer to it in comparison, it doesn't distract from the timbre of vocals as much. The timbre of vocals and most instruments just seems to be, honestly, more correct than I would typically expect for the HE1000 Unveiled, the Aria Stealth, and the OG. I am quite liking this slightly more relaxed tuning from Hifiman. There are two kind of drawbacks from it, or trade-offs I should say. The first thing being that this doesn't sound quite as spacious as some of their other models. So the Aria Stealth, for example. The Aria Stealth has a bigger soundstage. This is still a big sounding headphone. It stages very nicely, but it's not just as impressively airy and spacious sounding as the Aria can be. That's a bit of a party trick of that headphone. But the thing is that 2 kilohertz dip in particular, that is an area where you trade that off. If you have too much of it, then you can have a headphone that sounds huge, but vocals don't sound right. If you don't have enough of it, then vocals can sound great, but then it's just completely in your head, an HE600, for example. The other interesting thing is that even though the bass on this is actually measurably basically identical to something like the HE1000 Unveiled, because the really high treble stuff is not quite as high on this as it is on the HE1000 Unveiled or a Sesvara, this doesn't sound quite as tight and controlled in the bass because the transient aspect, the leading edge of a bass element, a kick drum for example, is not quite as high in amplitude. So it does just sound ever so slightly slower in terms of its bass. It's not quite as hard hitting, but it's still very good. But the other thing I have to call out with this, which is particularly good, is that, at least on my head anyway, I'm listening now and I'm trying to kind of find grievances with the treble. The overall level of it's just going to be a preference thing. Some people like brighter headphones, some people like darker headphones, but in terms of, narrow peaks and things that bother me, I'm not really picking up on any. The overall treble profile on this seems to be behaving really well. The Aria Unveiled had that 5 kilohertz weirdness going on. The Ananda Unveiled has a little bit of that too, which we'll talk about in a sec. But this one just, there's not really much I do in terms of narrowband EQ. It's just overall behaving really nice. It sounds pretty natural and realistic. Yeah, so the Edition XV is a really nice sounding headphone. It keeps a lot of the things that Hifiman is good at. It's still overall very neutral. It stages very well. It sacrifices some of the upper end limits of how well it can sound spacious for that slightly more relaxed tone, but then that's what options are for. If you would prefer something which is a bit brighter, more airy, they have other options which will do that. This is for the kind of people that don't want something that is going to be at risk of being too bright. And I think it does it really well. Okay, let's move on to Audivina LE. Let's just have a quick listen. This is just as horrible as the first one. I'm sorry. This is a bad headphone. Oh, I gotta put it back on if I want to talk about more stuff, and I really don't want to. Okay, so this is a closed back. There is no sub bass. It just doesn't exist. It is just mid bass. The mid range. Oh god, the mid range. It's just 1 kilohertz. It's like kind of honky, and the vocals sound incredibly weird and thin because the whole ear gain region is just gone. Around 3 kilohertz and a kilohertz either side of it, it's just sort of not there. Meanwhile, you go slightly above that towards the treble, and there's, I don't exactly know where it is, but there is a big peak somewhere. Everything sounds really thin and really kind of boxy at the same time, whilst having no body to it, because there are bits in the mid-range that are seemingly just missing. I'm just not going to spend too much time on this one. This one sounds very similar to the original Audivina. It is a bad headphone. I cannot recommend this. I'm sorry. Okay, so the Ananda Unveiled then. These are tuned much more towards Hifiman's more traditional signature, and in fact the Unveiled variant of these follows some of the changes that we've seen between previous Hifiman revisions of the original and Unveiled series, including the Susvara Unveiled, the HE1000 Unveiled. The biggest difference just being that the soundstage dip, the kind of 2 to 3 kilohertz area, is a bit more filled in. And that's quite nice, because whilst it does mean that these don't stage quite as big, they don't give you the spaciousness effect to quite the same degree as the original Susvara, the original Ananda did, the vocals just sounds a bit more filled in, a bit more full-bodied, a bit more realistic, because the timbre is just a bit more realistic. It's closer to a DF HRTF response. And overall, whilst this is a trade-off, it's one that I think most people are going to prefer this response. The overall level of treble is on these between sort of 3 and 7-ish kilohertz, just a couple dB bumped up versus these. These, again, are just a little bit darker than most Hifiman headphones, whereas these are much closer to the traditional tuning, including on the HE1000 Unveiled. The overall level of just brightness generically on these and HE1000 Unveiled is about the same. The thing that's kind of interesting about the Ananda Unveiled, and why I'm not super excited about them, I don't think they're bad at all, they're a good headphone, I'm just not excited about them in the same way that I am about the HE600 or the Edition XV, is that these have a similar overall tuning to the HE1000 Unveiled. These sound about a similar level of generic brightness to me, but these sound quite a bit more detailed than the Ananda Unveiled do. And I think a lot of that's because I'm not getting quite as much upper treble, like past 10 kilohertz or so, the really, really high frequency stuff. When I'm listening to them, they come across about the same level of brightness. I'm not finding any one of these more fatiguing to listen to or anything like that, but these just come across more technical. I just get better detail retrieval on the HE1000 Unveiled versus the Ananda Unveiled. In subjective technicalities, these sound kind of similar in level to me as the Edition XV, and the Edition XV is a slightly darker headphone overall than these. It's a little bit more of a tame listen, and so you wouldn't necessarily expect it to have the same level of subjective detail retrieval, because it tends to be that there is a bit of a trade-off between general brightness and how detailed something sounds. But these are a slightly brighter sounding headphone, and so being brighter without giving me those technicalities kind of just leaves me feeling like there's something a little bit missing. On those, I don't miss the in-your-face technicalities and incisiveness because that's not the tuning that it's got. Whereas these, it does have the tuning that feels like it should be delivering that, but it just kind of doesn't do that. So I have enjoyed listening to the Ananda Unveiled. I'm struggling to say whether I prefer the original versus this. I think it's more just a little bit different, and it's, again, the same sort of changes that you expect on most of the Unveiled line. The 2 kilohertz dip is a little bit filled in, vocals do sound a little bit better on this, but I think that the original one might actually have the edge in technicalities. It just sounds a little bit more detailed, a little bit more impressive. If the slightly brighter, more traditional Hifiman sound is what you're looking for, then either the original Ananda or something like the HE1000, the Aria Stealth in particular, actually, that's a more price-appropriate recommendation. I think those are generally better recommendations. I would pick an Aria Stealth over this. So yeah, I've enjoyed listening to this one. I just didn't come away feeling all that excited about it. These ones I am quite excited about though. This is the HE600, and out of the 4, these are hands down my favorite. There are some things which I'm less keen on about these versus the others, in particular the comfort. You can see that these ones are using more circular cups compared to the egg shape on the other ones, and that does mean that my ear does touch the pads a little bit. I do find these ones slightly less comfortable to wear just for that reason alone, even though the rest of the headband is exactly the same. I just prefer the egg style shape where my ear does not touch the pads. But in terms of sound, these ones, hands down, take the cake. The first thing to note with the HE600 is that the bass on these is definitely different to not just the other 3 models that I'm talking about today, but also the other Hifiman headphones in the past. There's a low frequency elevation to these, not in the mid bass or anything. It's not a 100 hertz hump. It's somewhere closer to 50-ish. It's a more sub-bass lift, and it just makes things sound more punchy. The bass on these is particularly engaging. It's not overdone. It's like a couple dB compared to Hifiman's other models, but I'm really enjoying it. It just makes things sound more authoritative, a little bit more full, a little bit hard hitting without being high enough in frequency to make things sound bloomy. It still sounds really tight and controlled. The overall mid-range is pretty similar to most Hifiman headphones. It's very flat. There's not really any major colorations there. There's a little bit of a soundstage dip around 2 kHz, but I think not as much as most Hifiman headphones. It's much more similar to the newer Unveiled variants where that's a little bit more filled in. Still there, and these do stage quite well, but again, it's just not quite as overly expansive as a Susvara OG or an original Aria, original HE1000, that kind of thing. The thing that's really making me smile about these though is that the overall profile of the treble is just great. It fits my head exceptionally well, and I'd say it's kind of some of the best sounding treble overall that Hifiman's done in a while. There's a little bit less of a focus on the sort of 3 kHz, so these just don't get shouty. The vocals are prominent, and it's got a little bit more ear gain than I'm used to hearing on the Hifiman headphones, but it's almost like the stuff above 3 kHz is just a little bit bumped up, and the 3 kHz itself is a little bit bumped down, and for me, that just makes things sound a bit more realistic. The timbre on these for vocals is better than, I think, almost any other Hifiman headphone besides maybe the Susvara OG. I'm not getting any major peaks or dips or anything like that. There is just the right amount of upper treble, not just absolutely, but in relation to how much ear gain there is. It just feels like it's very neutral overall, starting from sort of 3 kHz all the way out to about 20 kHz. And that's fantastic, because most of the other Hifiman headphones, there's either a little bit of a peak, or the, like we saw on the Ananda Unveiled, the upper treble and the ear gain itself is kind of slightly imbalanced. Whereas this just works. They've done a really good job with these, and this is the one that I found myself listening to the most. Not just for evaluation, but just for my own enjoyment. I'm really enjoying listening to these headphones. They have just the right amount between stage and timbre. They have just the right amount between being detailed and technical without pushing the upper treble too far and becoming harsh or bright. And again, the level of ear gain is just about the right amount to make things sound present and focused without being shouty or without being subdued, that it becomes a relaxed sounding headphone. It's just overall a very transparent sounding headphone. Under $1,000, these are $800. I think these are pretty exceptional value. This is the first headphone that I've heard that I think makes it so that the Aria Stealth, which is currently $549, doesn't necessarily make as much sense as the recommendation anymore. Previously, I would have just said, get an Aria Stealth. At that price, it would be stupid to get most other things. Whereas now, I would probably want to pay the extra couple hundred and get these. These are exceptionally good. In many ways, I feel like these are potentially, and I might eat my words here later, but potentially the closest thing to an actual spiritual HE6 successor that I've heard since the HE6, and that includes the HE6 SE. I personally wasn't really a fan of the HE6 SE. I much prefer the original HE6, but these, I really wish I had an HE6 here to compare to, because there's a lot about these which is reminding me of the original HE6. I think maybe there's some differences in the treble. The HE6, particularly the 6-screw one, there was a little bit of a sort of peakiness going on, whereas this doesn't really have that. But the bass in particular, that's the thing that's really fueling my words here. The bass on these is just noticeably harder hitting than most of the other Hifiman designs. It's got that slight sub-bass elevation that usually you just don't see. Most of the other Hifiman designs, the open back ones anyway, not the Audivina, are very linear, very flat bass, whereas these, they've definitely got a little bit of a lift. That, combined with having a good amount of upper treble and just the right amount of ear gain, makes things sound not just punchy and prominent in the bass, but actually fast, tactile, and incisive. It sounds excellent. So to conclude, the HE600 is a fantastic headphone. This is my favorite of the 4 by far, and it's probably my favorite Hifiman headphone that's come out in recent years. In fact, it's just one of the better headphones that I've heard in recent years, period. They've done an excellent job with these. The main thing that I would want to change on them is just the comfort. I'm not much of a fan of these circular cups because my ears do touch the edges a little bit. I do prefer the egg star design, but you're not going to be able to swap that out without changing the tuning, and the tuning on these is great. The Ananda Unveiled, I'm not really sure what to think about them. They're a good headphone, I've enjoyed them, but I also just think that they kind of sit in the middle a little bit too much, and they don't necessarily excel at any one particular thing. If you are more of the kind of person that wants a very detailed technical listen, then an HE1000 Unveiled and Aria Stealth, those are both going to give you more of that. The HE600 is also more detailed, more engaging, and just an overall better listen. And then if you're not so fussed about detail and you just care about the tuning, I think the overall tuning of the Edition XV, particularly for people that found other Hifiman headphones a little bit too bright, is just better overall. So these are a good headphone, I just think it's a bit overshadowed by Hifiman's own other models. The Edition XV is the one that I think most people are going to find themselves interested in. This is a bit of a departure from Hifiman's typical signature. It is just a little bit warmer, a little bit more full-bodied. It's not as detailed as the HE600 or the HE1000 Unveiled, but it is not far off. It still stages excellently. It's still a very technical headphone, and the tuning differences are ones that I really enjoyed, and I think a lot of other people are going to like as well. So if you like Hifiman headphones but just found that you wanted to tame that brightness a little bit, this is the answer to that, and I think it does a great job. And then there is also the Audivina LE if you hate listening to music. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know in the comments which particular models here you'd like to see full dedicated reviews for, and we'll have proper measurements for all of these as soon as possible as well. In the meantime, if you've got any questions about the differences between these four models or anything else at all, come and say hey on the Headphones.com Discord server or the Headphones.com forum, where I and other wiggly air enthusiasts will endeavor to help. And if you want to buy headphones but you're not necessarily sure what it is you actually like, well, consider Headphones.com for your next audio purchase, because you can buy a headphone, and if it turns out you don't like it all that much, you have 365 days to return it. I'm GoldenSound, you're watching The Headphone Show by Headphones.com. I'll see you next time.